Today, I want to introduce one of those must-see films in your lifetime, a work adapted from a true story. This is not only an excellent piece on anti-racism, but also instills courage in countless viewers to face the adversities of life and change themselves. The main character is Tony, a bouncer at a nightclub, or in other words, a tough guy with a knack for handling things. He resolves all the club's troubles until one day, the club has to temporarily close for renovations, leaving him jobless. As the sole breadwinner for his family, Tony has to find a way to make money. He even participates in an eating contest to win $50, competing against the town's biggest eater. Arriving home, he proudly tells his wife, "I used $50 to enter a sausage eating contest. That guy ate 24, like a monster." But he couldn't beat Tony because Tony finished 26. The next morning, upon waking up, Tony saw the black repairman who came to their house use their family's cup. As soon as his wife saw the repairman off, he threw the cup in the trash. That's right, he was a racist towards black people. Unexpectedly, an old friend called to offer him a job, saying a doctor was looking for a driver. Tony didn't think twice, dressed neatly, and went for the interview. He was led into a luxurious room, but the person who appeared before him was black. Indeed, that was the boss he was about to interview. This immediately disappointed Tony. The man got straight to the point. His name was Don Shirley, a pianist. Next, he would be touring the South, where racism was most severe. Therefore, to protect his life and avoid unnecessary trouble, he wanted to hire a bodyguard and driver. After reviewing Tony's resume, Don felt he was the most suitable candidate, being good with his hands and handling things skillfully. However, Tony felt very uncomfortable at the thought of having a black boss. But out of respect for the old friend who introduced him, he decided to demand an exorbitant salary to make Don give up. Surprisingly, the next morning, Don called and agreed to Tony's terms. $120 a week, equivalent to his previous month's salary, and the job was simply to drive Don to scheduled performance venues. Tony was overjoyed. Before setting off, Don's company paid Tony half his pay in advance and gave him a green book. Because in America at that time, many black people relied on the contents of this book to avoid unnecessary trouble. In other words, without this book, black people could hardly move an inch. His wife came to see Tony off and asked him to return before Christmas. And so, these two strangers began a mysterious tour. As soon as they set off, Don told Tony two mandatory things he had to do for him. One was that the piano he played had to be a Steinway, and the second was to prepare a bottle of Cutty Sark for him every night. Tony sat in the front, eating the breakfast his wife prepared for him and smoking. He was naturally talkative, so his mouth never stopped chattering. Don endured it for a long time, finally ordering Tony to stop smoking. On the way, Tony stopped the car to use the restroom, not forgetting to take his wallet from the car. This made Don, who was in the car, very angry. That evening, they arrived at their first stop. Tony accidentally discovered the members of Don's band flirting with girls downstairs, while Don could only sit alone on the balcony, lonely drinking his Cutty Sark. Before the performance the next day, Don found Tony and instructed him, "After the performance, we'll often attend some parties and events. When you talk later, pay attention to your wording. Inside, they're all elegant high society people." Tony, to Don's surprise, replied, "I don't care about them. It's up to them whether they want to listen or not." "Use polite language? Boss, why are you making it so hard for me?" Don replied, "Because you can do better." So the performance quickly began. Through the host's introduction, Tony finally understood why this black pianist was invited to tour. He first performed on stage at the age of 2. At 18, he was invited by conductor Arthur Fiedler to perform with the Boston Pops Orchestra in his first concert. He held doctorates in psychology, music, and religion. In the past 14 months, he had performed twice at the White House. He was a true artistic master. Don played the piano passionately, the magnificent melody astonishing everyone present. Tony also truly felt his extraordinary talent. However, immediately after, he was back on the floor, busy gambling with other servants. That evening, they returned to their lodging. In the letter to his wife, besides the usual greetings, Tony mentioned Don for the first time. He wrote that when he watched Don play, he completely forgot that he was black, and even asserted that he was a genius. He just didn't understand why Don, who had both fame and fortune, always seemed unhappy. The next day, the two continued their journey. Passing a rest stop, Tony was attracted by some beautiful small stones in a shop. He thought of buying one for his wife, but as soon as he saw the price, he gave up the idea. However, when he looked down, he found a stone that had fallen on the ground. He instinctively bent down, picked it up, and put it in his pocket very naturally. This action was coincidentally seen by a member of Don's band. When Don found out, he asked Tony to return the stone, but Tony said he found it on the ground, so why should he return it? Don seriously said, "If you don't return it, we won't go on." Although unwilling, Tony eventually compromised. Not long after, they arrived at the next performance stop. Tony checked the piano on site as Don requested, as usual. But when he got there, what greeted him was a messy piano, full of trash inside. So he found the staff there to inquire about the situation. According to the performance contract, they had to provide a Steinway piano, but the staff member seemed indifferent and said, "Why bother cleaning it? This piano is good enough for that black guy to play." The result was that in the very next second, Tony, without a word, slapped him. Afterward, the performance began. Watching Don on stage, Tony stood beside him, happy as a child. Perhaps he didn't even realize that Don had gradually entered his heart. In his letters to his wife, stories about Don became more and more frequent. On the way to their third stop, they passed a fried chicken restaurant. Tony bought a large bucket and started eating heartily in the car. Then he offered a chicken leg to Don in the back to eat with him. Tony persuaded him for a long time, and finally, Don had to pick up the chicken leg with his fingers and carefully open his mouth to eat the first fried chicken in his life. Afterward, he too was conquered by the crispy taste of the fried chicken. "What about this bone?" Tony opened the window and threw it out. Don smiled and followed suit, throwing the bone out the window. But immediately after, Tony threw the cup out. Seeing this, Don asked Tony to go back and pick it up because bones would be eaten by animals or decompose naturally, while the cup would only pollute the environment. That evening, they arrived in Kentucky. The further south they went, the more severe racial discrimination became. The two could only stay in different hotels. Don stayed in a small, shabby inn. As usual, he sat alone, drinking whiskey. However, in his elegant suit, he looked out of place among the other black people around him. A black man next to him wanted to invite him to play ball. To avoid awkwardness, he lied that he was going to meet friends. Not long after, there was an urgent knock on Tony's room door. It was the band members. They said Don was in trouble. The two of them immediately ran there. They arrived at a bar and found Don drunk and beaten up by a group of white men. At this moment, Tony spoke up, asking them to stop, but the opponents, relying on their numbers, began to provoke him, even drawing knives to threaten him. Seeing this, Tony slowly reached behind his back, making a motion to draw a gun. Finally, he managed to get Don out. Outside, Tony seriously told Don that from now on, he had to be with him wherever he went, because the road ahead would become increasingly dangerous. Don, like a wounded child, obediently agreed. The next day, the performance went on as usual, still receiving enthusiastic applause. But not long after leaving, the car broke down. Seeing this, Tony got out to fix it. Don also got out to breathe some fresh air. But when they turned back, they saw their black brothers working hard under the scorching sun. Suddenly, they stopped, and all looked towards Don. Don's eyes also seemed to be pondering something. Although they were all black, they had two completely opposite fates. This made Don feel very uncomfortable. At the fourth stop before the performance, Don wanted to use the restroom but was stopped by the butler. He pointed to a makeshift outdoor toilet and said that was the only place he could use. Don flatly refused and said he would rather go back to the hotel. On the way back, Tony, puzzled, asked, "Why not just take care of it somewhere along the road?" Don said he had his self-respect. After the performance, he still politely shook everyone's hand. Tony told the musicians in the band, "If it were me, I would have bolted." At this point, another musician approached and said, "Don can enjoy the admiration of tens of thousands of people in the North and receive many times the pay here. But he still chooses to tour the South. His purpose is simply to break the stereotypes and discrimination of white people against black people." These words immediately changed Tony's perspective on Don. The next day, Tony wrote a letter to his wife. Don stood by, looking at the naive words and childlike spelling, and quickly took it to read. Indeed, Tony's letter was like a meticulous record, only writing about what he had done and what he had eaten each day. Don couldn't stand it anymore and said, "Let me help you refine it a bit. Dearest Dolores, when I think of you, I am reminded of the beautiful flat fields of Iowa. The distance between us makes me constantly long for you. Without you, my time and experiences become meaningless." Afterward, they arrived at their fifth stop. On the way, passing a clothing store, Don was suddenly attracted by a suit in the window. The two entered, intending to try on clothes, but the shop owner pulled them back, saying that black people were not allowed to try on clothes. Don just smiled and silently left. Tony saw everything but could do nothing. In the performance that night, he poured all his anger into the music, finding release only in this way. That evening, as Tony was preparing for bed, the phone rang. On the other end, Don said he was in trouble. Arriving at the scene, Tony witnessed an unbelievable sight. The police were about to arrest Don and the other man. Tony used money to bribe them to release Don, but as soon as they were outside, Don turned on him. Not only did he not thank Tony, but he also reprimanded him for bribing the police. The two then had a big argument and ended up unhappy. The next day, they arrived at their 6th stop. Tony accidentally met 2 friends who were also Italian. They saw Don next to Tony and began to tease Tony in Italian, saying that if he wanted to make money, he could come to them, asking why he had to work for that black guy. Tony said nothing, only saying, "See you tonight." But he didn't know that Don actually understood Italian. When Tony was about to go downstairs, he found Don standing at the door and saying seriously, "I hope you won't go. I don't want to lose this friend. I'll promote you and raise your salary immediately." But Tony flatly refused. Looking at Don at that moment, he seemed to become a helpless child. Tony then said, we agreed on $120 a week plus other expenses. We agreed, right? I'm not going anywhere. I'm just going downstairs to tell them about this." At this moment, Don felt incredibly sorry for Tony and sincerely apologized for last night. Tony replied, "Don't worry about it. I've worked in nightclubs my whole life. I know this world is very complicated." The next day, the two continued their tour. At a crossroads while waiting for the car, a girl nearby looked at them with disbelief. Then she called her boyfriend over to see, because it was a white man driving for a black man. It was important to know that at that time in the American South, this was completely impossible. But while the two of them were still surprised, Tony made a powerful international gesture. Next, they completed their 7th performance. On the way back that evening, they encountered a torrential downpour. Suddenly, a police car stopped them. Tony got out. The police officer told Tony, "This place is called a sunset town. The rule is that after sunset, black people are not allowed to stay here." And when the police officer saw Don in the car, he immediately changed his expression and demanded Don get out for a search, saying he was also half black. These words ignited Tony's anger. Afterward, both were taken to the police station. Don repeatedly demanded to call his lawyer, stating it was his right. Finally, the police officer allowed him to call. But not long after, a call came in, and it was from the local governor, the brother of the then President of the United States. Tony was also shocked. After getting out, Tony was very excited. This incident was enough for him to brag about his entire life. But Don was still very angry and felt ashamed. The two argued again. Tony said that every day he had to struggle to make a living and support his family, while Don was like a white king living high up in a castle. "Compared to you, I'm more like a black person." At this moment, Don suddenly realized that in Tony's eyes, black people were always the lower class. This immediately crushed Don. Don stepped straight out of the car and into the heavy rain. Tony chased after him and asked, "Where are you going?" Don said, "That's right. I live in a castle, Tony. It's the rich white people who invite me to play the piano to show they have culture. But as soon as I finish playing and step off the stage, I become the black man they despise and discriminate against. I am what they truly want, and I have to endure it all alone. I am not accepted by my own people, nor by white people. I am not even considered a man. Tony, tell me, what exactly am I?" Tony tried to say something to comfort him, but the words wouldn't come out. Finally, they arrived at the last stop of their tour. The manager politely arranged a cluttered storage room behind the kitchen as Don's dressing room. Tony and the other musicians in the band had dinner at the restaurant. But after changing, Don was informed that black people were not allowed to eat in the restaurant. This time, Don decided not to tolerate it anymore. "Unless you allow me to eat here, there will be no performance tonight." However, according to the contract, if any performance was not completed, Tony would not receive the remaining payment. The manager completely disregarded Don's words and called Tony aside, offering him money, trying to get Tony to resolve the issue. "Do you think you can buy me off? Please don't be insulting. If it weren't for the money, you wouldn't be working for a black man, would you?" "Stop it, Tony!" Don knew how much the remaining payment meant to Tony. So this time, he gave Tony the power to decide whether to perform. "If you agree, I will perform." But in the next second, Tony firmly led Don away from it. Afterward, the two found a small bar. It was full of black people. Under the strange gaze of everyone around them, they ate a hearty meal. Then, encouraged by Tony, Don stepped onto the stage, sat before the old piano, and began to improvise. This was the first time he performed for his own people. Everyone in the audience happily danced to the music. Don also smiled from the bottom of his heart, as if he hadn't relaxed like that in a long time, as if he had found his original self again. After leaving the bar so Tony could fulfill his promise to his wife, Don decided to return to New York immediately. But on the way, heavy snow began to fall. Don joked that Tony could take out the stone he had stolen, and it might bless them to arrive safely. It turned out he had known all along that Tony hadn't returned the stone. "Thank you. I feel much more at ease now." But they hadn't gone far when their car was stopped by the police again. This time, however, it was a kind reminder. And so, carrying this warmth, the two finally returned to New York on Christmas Eve. When they got out of the car, Tony invited Don to his house, but Don politely declined. Back home, Don sent his butler home for Christmas, while he remained alone in his large, empty house. Staring at the lucky stone in his hand, he felt lonely. Elsewhere, Tony's family was happily gathered, enjoying their New Year's Eve dinner. The family asked, "How do you feel about working for that black guy?" Tony heard this and seriously said, "Don't call him that." His wife was very surprised to see Tony's reaction. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Tony rushed to open it, and there was Don, awkwardly holding a bottle of wine. Tony stepped forward and hugged him, inviting him inside. He formally introduced him to his family. "This is my best friend, Dr. Don Shirley. Happy New Year." The film won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture at the 91st Academy Awards. It's not just a story about friendship transcending racial barriers, but also a powerful indictment against racial discrimination. Through Tony and Don's journey, we see change and acceptance, as well as the value of family and kinship. No matter how complicated the world may be, humanity and understanding can always prevail. The film is truly excellent, so I still recommend everyone watch the original. Today's story ends here. Thank you for watching. What do you think of this film? Please comment below.